Ibrahim Traoré stood before a room full of global leaders, economists and media personnel, his presence commanding but calm. Representing Burkina Faso, a nation often overlooked in the corridors of global power, Traoré wasn't there to play politics. He came with facts. His voice, though steady, carried weight as he began to challenge the long-standing influence of institutions like the International Monetary Fund. The audience listened, intrigued but skeptical. Few expected what would follow to completely upend the carefully maintained decorum of the event. Traoré's speech wasn't just bold, it was an unfiltered wake-up call. He began by recounting Burkina Faso's economic history, pointing directly to structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF. "For decades, we have followed your prescriptions," he said, "but we are still poor, still dependent, still trapped in debt cycles we didn't design." His words hit like thunder. The room, silent and tense, absorbed every word. Traoré didn't accuse vaguely. He cited data. GDP regression, post-loan agreements, collapsing local industries, and farming policies dictated by foreign advisors. He was not just criticizing, he was dismantling decades of economic manipulation. Looking directly at IMF representatives in the front row, he continued, "You say you help us stabilize, but what you really do is standardize our suffering, our dependency, our debt." He held up a report, quoting exact IMF terms imposed on African countries over the last 25 years. His words weren't rhetorical. They were researched, evidence-based, and cuttingly specific. A few attendees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Cameras zoomed in. The moment had become more than just a speech. It was a reckoning. For the first time, someone from the so-called Global South was confronting the power structure on its own stage. Traoré didn't spare Western media either. He exposed how coverage of Africa often omits the role of institutions that create the very crises they report on. They show starving children, but never explain who destroyed our food systems, he said, eliciting murmurs of agreement from delegates of other African nations. They frame our leaders as unstable, but say nothing about the instability that follows your economic warfare. His voice grew louder, more passionate. It was the kind of raw truth the world rarely hears in official forums. He then shifted to African unity and self-determination, pointing to recent regional efforts to reject Western-imposed economic doctrines. "We are not anti-development," he said. "We are anti-dependence. We are done being laboratories for your failed models." At this, several leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea nodded visibly. The message was spreading, not just to the IMF, but to every global body that assumed it could dictate Africa's future without accountability. Traoré's words were igniting a sense of empowerment far beyond the hall he stood in. Traoré also exposed the hypocrisy of IMF loans tied to good governance conditions, while ignoring how these same conditions are violated in countries favored by the West. "When we nationalize resources, you call it corruption. When your allies do it, you call it sovereignty," he said. The crowd buzzed. This wasn't just a speech, it was a mirror held up to the world's most powerful economic actors. And for once, they couldn't look away. Not because they didn't want to, but because truth has a way of forcing attention when it's undeniable. He closed the economic segment of his speech with a powerful quote from Thomas Sankara: "He who feeds you controls you." Then he added, "And we are reclaiming control." The applause began cautiously but grew louder. Some delegates hesitated, worried how their countries might be viewed for supporting such defiance. But others stood and clapped. The silence of the IMF leaders, now visibly uneasy, said more than any rebuttal could. They had no response ready for such precise truth, delivered without apology or fear. As he transitioned into closing remarks, Traoré reminded everyone, Africa does not need charity. We need justice. He stressed that this justice starts with ownership of resources, policy, and narrative. The world has long painted Africa as a continent needing saving. Traoré flipped that image. "You cannot save us from systems you built to keep us here," he said. "What we need is for you to stop standing in the way of our liberation." It was a moment of brutal honesty, the kind that doesn't fit in headlines, but reshapes minds. As the speech concluded, no dramatic music played, no pre-approved statement followed. Traoré simply stepped back from the podium, nodded to the room, and walked off. But the silence he left behind spoke volumes. For hours, media outlets scrambled to frame the moment. Some praised his boldness, others called it controversial. But in every outlet, one thing was clear: Ibrahim Traoré had spoken truths that could not be ignored. He had challenged the legitimacy of institutions that for decades operated without resistance. In the days that followed, his speech spread across the internet like wildfire. Young Africans shared it with pride. Political thinkers dissected every line. Even leaders from Asia and Latin America echoed his sentiment, suggesting a global awakening against economic imperialism. Traoré's moment wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about every nation that has ever been told to stay in line. And in one fact-filled, fearless speech, he didn't just silence the IMF. He amplified the voice of a continent ready to rise on its own terms.